I know I'm breaking that promise I made, but this is probably going to be worth it. Plus, Starmer's going to be resigning next month, hopefully, so it barely counts as me breaking the promise. Plus, I needed something quick and easy to talk about because of my birthday and the consequences of it, which were pretty severe in different ways. The last video I did in this series focused on the Gorton and Denton by-elections aftermath and the proliferation of sectarianism as an explanation for how the Greens won the seat. It turns out that this by-election is the gift that keeps on giving, because what it's done is it's led to a series of shifts in tactics from all of the Green Party's detractors. The lines used before this by-election, whether it was the notion that Zach Polanski was personally going to hand out crack pipes to people, or the idea that Labour were the party best placed to beat reform, a hypothesis that really did implode upon contact with reality, just don't work. Certainly not in enough of the country that you can rely on it anymore as an attack line. So I was curious, what next? Would they recycle some old tactics, maybe find some new ones? Because one thing Labour won't do is go out with honour or dignity, nor will the right-wing press tolerate a challenger that sits remotely on the left. There had to be something up their sleeve. Largely this has taken the form of accusations around anti-Semitism, which is at once very predictable and not really suited to the format of this video, seeing as, for reasons that I hope are obvious, it requires more sensitivity than a video series called STFU and a lot more research than I put into these shorter ones. There's also been the characteristic entitlement, and Labour are apparently planning to recycle the Titnosis attack, which, you know, good luck with that, I guess. If that's the worst thing he's done over the past 15 or so years, I wouldn't be too worried if I was a Green supporter. Instead, what I want to talk about is a form of argument that has been recycled, but also annoys me enough that I think I need to get this out of my system. The background is this. Zach Polanski, the Green Party leader, gave a speech to the New Economics Foundation where he largely set out what his economic agenda is and would look like as the Greens gain more traction. The agenda itself wasn't terribly interesting. It mostly consisted of the right things being said, alongside a handful of policies I would describe as typically left of centre. You know, rent controls, wealth taxes, renationalising water, things like this. Nothing that should shock us, and nothing really to write home about when it's being said by a self-professed eco-populist. Some people have chosen to respond to this with an argument along the lines of the areas where they're seeking to make policy or enact changes are in fact very complicated. The subtext being that we can't do those things because some element of the complexity described has been ignored. This was actually one of the B-plot style arguments that would get deployed against basically any relatively simple left-wing argument, and I can see why centrists and right-wingers love this line. It's really good for having the appearance of substance and the appearance of credibility, when really all it is a relationship status used on Facebook by awkward teens in the 2000s. Showing my age a bit there, but you get the picture, hopefully. It isn't in itself a political argument, but more of a deflection, and a deflection that's often deployed in one specific direction, which I guess means we have to dissect how it's supposed to work, since it's often directed leftwards. It's quite simple, actually. This argument exploits something that we all intuit about the world around us, namely that things are actually complicated. I think there are very few areas of politics where there are multiple inputs and outputs that then go on to impact other things, and it's basically the entire history of humans since the Epic of Gilgamesh was a new track, which leads to someone saying their political opponents aren't appreciating the complexity of the issues or insisting that this complexity merits complex solutions. A good example of this is part of Labour MP Stella Creasy's whinging article in The Guardian about how mean everyone is to her, where she sort of said, oh, sometimes we need complex solutions and that's not popular. Which means that if someone, say Zach Polanski, comes out and says we should decouple energy prices from gas prices in the wake of, just as an example I'm picking out of nowhere, the global imperial hegemon and its genocidal outpost launching an obviously illegal war on a country it was in negotiations with, resulting in a critical shipping route for energy resources being closed. This is seen as an intervention into a complex system that hasn't considered the details, because it is mechanically quite simple, and a lot of people don't really understand how the energy market works. So people who are on the fence may go, yeah, maybe it is too complicated, and you see how effective it is here, because I'm sat here talking about whether the thing is complicated or not, instead of the political argument, which is renewables are generally cheaper than fossil fuels, we should roll it out, and in the meantime, intervene to make energy cheaper. You can create jobs, address climate change, and insulate ourselves from the whims of America or other fossil fuel-rich countries who we don't want to give leverage to. It's also predicated on the idea that whoever is making the intervention, from national politicians to random YouTubers to the guy down the pub, hasn't thought about the complexities, which is a pretty big assumption to make, and is the kind of thing, in the case of politicians, that journalists ought to be able to tease out of them. Anyway, I'll save that particular commentary for another day. The main way it's effective is that it's playing on a caution often displayed in liberal, centre-left-ish to centre-right-ish circles, which is to be wary of people who provide simple answers, because often there are terms and conditions to simple answers that don't tend to result in particularly good outcomes, like unjust scapegoating and all of the general fallout you get from that kind of thing. Which isn't wrong. A lot of the time that caution is justified. There's a reason why we don't click on those one weird trick adverts, because there isn't usually one weird trick to solve a problem, whether that's getting a six-pack in 12 weeks or making things in the UK actually functional in the immediate term. I'm as likely to achieve the former as the political class is to achieve the latter. There is a limitation to this framework, though, which is that not all solutions are created equal, and you should probably pay attention at least a little bit to what's actually being offered or said. I find it hard to believe that someone could have heard or read the transcript of Polanski's speech and come to the conclusion that he was thoughtlessly peddling interventions into complicated systems. A great example of this is rent controls. He probably deliberately didn't specify a particular model of rent controls, but said that there were a number of models we could learn from. It's not exactly coming across like he stood up at the lectern and said, I'm gonna make rent cheap, without elaborating or thinking about it. But that's just it. How many people are gonna watch the whole speech or read the whole transcript? And how many people know a whole lot about the private or social rented sectors? How many people know about the energy sector and how energy prices are set? If we're honest, it's not as many as we might like. The temptation is, when you don't know about something, to assume it's complicated, because that's just how things tend to be, and it's easy to assume that other people are as clueless as you, which means often people miss a simple truth about complex systems, which is that they can have valid, simple, or at least simpler solutions. Not to lean too heavily on this as an example, because it's going to make some people who know me very angry, but a lot of quite complex looking maths at least has one very simple solution, and if you're not familiar with it, then it can look quite ridiculous to see such a simple solution to a complex looking equation. The fact is, though, that looking complex and being complex can be two very different things. The function of the complexity argument is weirdly the same as those annoying questions you get in maths exams where they have a whole scenario associated with them to sow confusion and force you to pick out the key parts of the information. My proofreader, incidentally, she wanted me to communicate at this point that she found these easy, but I didn't. So yes, she's smarter than me. What else is new? Are you happy now, proofreader? I said it on camera. Are you happy now? It's hard enough if you do know about the topic at hand, but if, like most people, you don't, then it can be overwhelming. And the default position of a lot of people when they're overwhelmed is, best not mess with that. It's asking you to confuse the ends with the means. The second you start to think things like energy prices, rent, who owns the water companies are in and of themselves complicated, changing them in a way that benefits most of us becomes harder to envision. It dupes people who otherwise might mean well into arguing for the opposite of what would benefit them, since it's a purely defensive argument. It has the benefit of appearing intelligent and thoughtful, but with none of the actual work of being either of those things. It's much more comforting to appear as if you are a wise person confronting reality if you have a lot of excuses to stop you from actually doing that. A question kept occurring to me as I was thinking about this. Why isn't this line used against the right and the centre? The left are not unique in having simple rhetoric targeted at problems that you could imagine as complex. If you take the British centre, some are particularly fond of saying we should simply rejoin the EU. Now, whether you agree with that or not, that is a process that will be complicated, not least because of the way we conducted ourselves while negotiating our exit, but you don't see many people criticize that along that line, or with the right. You could take the long-standing Conservative Party policy on immigration in the 2010s, which was to reduce net immigration to under 100,000, despite the fact that immigration and the reasons why people move between different places can be very complicated. Like, in my own case, I am in the middle of a very complicated deliberation on whether to leave the UK or not, which is the case for everyone who considers emigrating or immigrating to any particular country. Now, I'm not saying that if we'd attacked the Tory party for not being sufficiently detail-oriented about immigration in their policy, that things would have turned out different. In this case, it wouldn't have. One, because the number isn't actually the problem, and I talked about that in my video about legitimate concerns. Two, because the one thing that the arbitrary immigration target was meant to do was to excuse lowering living standards in the UK, since one of the big pull factors for people to move here was the fact that the UK, for all of its many faults, wasn't terrible. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it was good for everyone, but it wasn't as bad as it is now. And finally, it wouldn't have worked because the right and the centre don't care. They don't have to care, but they definitely don't care. Because it is the default position for most of the media through which people get their political news that these groups are the groups who know what they're talking about. You know, the so-called adults in the room. That title is exchanged between them based on convenience and based on who's knackered in government and who's not. But it is part of this. The other more cynical answer to why this isn't deployed on the right and the centre is that the people who can deploy it in an impactful way largely already agree with those positions, so why would you voluntarily trip up your own side? It works on the left precisely because we are usually more detail-oriented, so we will get bogged down in it instead of actually speaking directly to people. It's the same trick that gets played when people demand credible plans in order to defend a discredited orthodoxy. This is a particular favourite of economists, some of you will note, It's a great tactic. It bogs us down in details in whether something is complicated or not, and it forces us to tip our hand, all while, no matter what we say, discrediting us. It's a really good tactic. It takes a strength and turns it into a weakness. It doesn't matter if you present sources or if you're a subject matter expert. The second you engage on this ground, you're trapped. So how do you deal with it? The obvious solution is to not care, to engage in the same sloppiness that the center and the right do, and just plow on, which is appealing because it requires the least work. And, I'm a kind of lazy person, so that does appeal to me, but it does ignore the big issue, which is that the rules are different for different groups. The first step is to understand the difference between ends and means. When a left of center politician says something like, we should reduce the cost of living, we should understand that's a goal, and that a speech from a politician isn't going to do all the hard work. So when someone acts as if it will, we should know that we can dismiss them. That's not the same as not caring, that's not the same as dismissing the idea of complexity at all, but it is having a little confidence that actually sometimes maybe we do know what we're talking about, that the people we delegate our political authority to may have actually deigned to do a little work, sometimes. If we or whoever we seek to empower through our support gets bogged down in details, gets stuck explaining, gets trapped, they'll find themselves unable to escape. It's not necessarily decisive. It's not going to, it's not the coin toss upon which fate is decided, but it's the kind of thing that could contribute to a general mood that makes people think you're kind of a dickhead. There's a lot of negativity around populism, which this argument is usually deployed in opposition to. And I have some complicated feelings about populism that we do not have time for. But as my dad pointed out to me, shout out to my dad who watches all the videos, by the way, there is value in being a populist communicator, plainly stating that yes, things are complicated, but sometimes the solutions are actually kind of simple. And it's an obvious thing to do. For most of us, we're not going to be asked by journalists to explain policy. We are largely engaging in a rhetorical conflict with other just general members of the general public. If you're interested in an area, read about it, be on top of it, but it's not what's important for most of us. Be plain spoken, be clear, be passionate even, but don't get bogged down, and don't let people who cling to complexity as an excuse to maintain or degrade the status quo get away with it. Tell them, from me, to shut the fuck up. I worked it into this one. I didn't know how I was going to work it into it, but that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, subscribe, all of the good stuff. I need to thank my proofreader who gave me a few very interesting notes on this and finally managed to get me to cave and say that little bit earlier on. So there you go. I hope she's happy. I also need to shout out the patrons and members. If you would like the videos early, you want to vote on the topic of the videos, all of the usual, Patreon membership stuff. There's a Discord, there's a super secret bit of it for patrons and members. You can join the Patreon, or you can join the YouTube membership. And if you're a top tier patron or a YouTube member, you get this cheeky little shout out. So shout out to my top tier patrons: Drone Riff, Kazli Shider, John N, Liron, Jar Jar Muba, and Carolyn, absolute legends. And to the YouTube members: Nada Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Ben Johnson, also absolute legends. Thank you to them, and thank you to you if you've made it this far. I will catch you all on the next video, which will be quite a bit longer, quite a bit more detailed, and probably I will feel less terrible because I'm currently not feeling very well as I record this. So I will catch you all then. See ya and have a good one.